Peter Schiff is totally wrong about the United States dollar. And I'm going to explain why in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over Peter's argument for why the dollar is going to crash. But before we do, I want to point out Peter's a very good friend. I have a ton of respect for him. And he went on a video, or he commented on a video I did last week and said, George, what you are missing is that the dollar is going to crash. He says, you need to go back to the drawing board. I said, Peter, that's actually a great idea. What I'm going to do next week is I'm going to do a whiteboard video. I'll take your suggestion, but I'm going to do a whiteboard video on why the dollar isn't going to crash. So here's the whiteboard video. Now that said, let's start by looking at a chart going all the way back to, I call it 2009 to today's date. On the left, we go from 70 up to 120. This is a DXY, so a measurement of the dollar against other currencies. And by the way, Peter's argument isn't that the dollar is just going to crash against goods and services in the United States. His argument, it's going to crash against other foreign currencies. So this is a good proxy. So we start by going back to 2008, 2009. It's right around 80. And I want to point out at the beginning of 2009, it's when they start QE, quantitative easing. The Fed's balance sheet goes up and up and up and up. More on that in just a moment. But when we started back in 2009, right around 80, where are we today? Well, we're right around 100, meaning that the dollar has appreciated, has gone up in value during this time frame against the majority of other currencies. Okay, well, Peter's argument is because the deficits are going to explode, because the US debt is going to explode, because the Fed's balance sheet is going to explode. This is why the dollar is going to crash. Because let's think about it. If the United States is issuing more and more and more and more debt, Peter's argument is there isn't going to be enough buyers, and therefore the Fed is going to come and expand their balance sheet by doing quantitative easing. And all of this money printing, quote unquote, is going to lead to the dollar going down in value. And this is going to prompt foreigners to get rid of their dollars, these hot potatoes, as fast as they can. And all those dollars are going to come flooding into the United States, creating more consumer price inflation, which is going to lead to more foreigners dumping those dollars. And keep in mind, this is happening when the trade deficits are getting more and more extreme, meaning more and more dollars are leaving the United States, circulating in the global economy, putting further downward pressure on the dollar, not just against goods and services, but again, against other foreign currencies. So the first thing we have to do is ask ourselves, during this time when the dollar went from, let's say, 80 up to approximately 100, what was going on with all of these key metrics Peter uses in his argument as to why the dollar is going to crash against other foreign currencies? Editor, let's go ahead and throw up some charts. First and foremost, let's look at the deficits as a percentage of GDP in the United States. And we can see, going back to call it 2007, 2008, it was right around 3%. Well, now it's at 6%. So the deficit as a percentage of GDP has gotten much, much worse. And as a result, as you would imagine, the United States debt has gone straight up. But what's crazy is to look at the degree to which the debt has, quote unquote, exploded. So editor, throw up another chart, and we can see going back to 2008 or so, the United States debt was about 10 trillion. Today, 35 trillion, an increase of about $25 trillion. That's a lot of treasuries. Let me tell you what. And I'd also like to point out that just since 2019, the debt has gone from 22 trillion up to the 35 trillion that it is today. So just in the last 4 years or so, the United States debt has increased by $13 trillion, well over 50%. Oh, but wait, there is more. Let's not forget about the Fed's balance sheet. We go back to 2008 or so, just prior to QE, and the Fed's balance sheet was right around $800 billion. But then you guys know what happened. It went straight up to a point where we got up to $9 trillion. Now today, it's back down to around 7. But still, $7 trillion. I'm no math genius, but $7 trillion is a lot more than where they started, $800 billion. But that's not all. Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of foreign central bank FX reserves. And we can see that the dollar percentage of these overall reserves has been declining steadily. And let's not forget about the trade deficits. If you go back to where they were, let's just say in 2008, or even where they were in 2019, they're a lot worse today. Back then, they're right around 40 billion per month. Today, almost 80 billion a month. The bottom line is everything Peter predicted has come true. The deficits exploded. The debt exploded. The Fed's balance sheet exploded. Central banks have been dumping dollars. And the trade deficits are getting worse and worse and worse. But what has happened to the dollar? It's strengthened. It's appreciated. It's gained value against other foreign currencies. Now, let me be very clear. I am not saying just because the dollar hasn't crashed that it'll never crash moving forward. But what I am saying is if all of these things that should have brought the dollar to its knees played out, and the dollar did the opposite, to predict the probabilities of the dollar crashing in the future, you've got to figure out why it hasn't crashed in the past. Step number 2. Here's why everything Peter Schiff has predicted over the past 15 years has come true, except the direction of the dollar. We have to start by understanding that especially outside of the United States, it's a debt-based monetary system. So banks aren't taking existing dollars and lending them to other people. When they create the loan, they're also creating brand new dollars that didn't exist. It's basically credit. So when those dollars are paid back to the bank, then the amount of outstanding dollars decreases by the exact same amount that it was increased at the very beginning when the loan was originated. Okay, now we understand that. We have to realize there's about 315 trillion in debt outside of the United States. Very broad approximation, about 150 trillion is denominated in dollars. Let's say $75 trillion exists to pay the 150 trillion. Now it is true that I can get a $500,000 loan from a bank and then lend it to someone else. That's $1 million in debt. But since I'm not a bank, I didn't create those dollars. Therefore, that's $1 million of debt, but only $500,000 are owed back to the bank. So what we want to do for this example is we want to focus on the amount that is owed to the bank, because that's what on net balance can increase the amount of dollars if there's more loans that are being created than paid off, or decrease the amount of dollars if the opposite is happening, where more loans are being paid off than created. So let's assume that out of this 100 trillion, we've got 75 principal, 25 in interest. You guys get that pretty straightforward. Now, before we go into our example, let's assume the DXY is trading at 100, the dollar relative to all these other currencies. So we've got 3 guys, and they all have balance sheets. Guy 1, guy 2, guy 3. Now we're going to go in reverse order. We're going to start with guy 3 because he's the one that initially wants to dump his dollars. He's sick and tired of it. He wants to sell his dollars for the new ruble currency, let's say, and that is represented by this red R. Okay, now the great thing about guy number 3 is currently, and this is before he sells his dollars, He only has assets. He doesn't have any liabilities. Now, the other two guys are different. More on them in just a moment. But he takes these dollars, goes into the global FX market, says, I want to sell these things. I want rubles. So those dollars go on to, let's say, the aggregate balance sheet of the FX market. So they started with these rubles, but they sold them to guy number 3 for the dollars. So now they have these dollars on their balance sheet, and these rubles go onto the balance sheet of guy number 3. Now, it is true, this process alone would put downward pressure on the dollar, all else being equal. So let's assume that we started with the DXY at 100, but because guy 3 dumped his dollars, now we're down to 95. Cool. Now let's take a look at guy number 2. Now, guy number 2 has, let's say, $10,000 of assets. Now, this is just his bank balance, $10,000, and it's denominated in USD, by the way. And then he has a USD denominated loan, but the payments, principal plus interest, is going to be about $15,000 if he waits, let's say, a year to pay off the loan. But remember, if he paid off the loan right now, he might only have to pay $10,000 because he wouldn't have to pay all that interest that will accrue. Okay. Now let's assume guy number 2 works for guy number 3, and guy number 3, as you know, doesn't want to deal with dollars anymore. So he says, guy number 2, from now on, your paycheck is going to be denominated in rubles. And guy number 2 says, okay, I got a great job. Yeah, that's fine, no problem. But I do have an issue. The issue is I have all of these monthly payments, and the bank won't take rubles. They'll only take dollars. So now I've got to make a decision. Either I can pay off this debt, assuming that if he pays it off right now, he's definitely incentivized to pay it off right now, so he won't have to pay any more of this interest. And then that would extinguish the dollar-denominated debt. He wouldn't have that dollar liability, so he wouldn't have to take the FX risk. Or what he can do is just say, yeah, you know what? I'm just going to roll the dice. And I'm going to take my set amount of rubles every single month, and then I'm going to take what is needed, turn them into dollars, and that's what I'm going to use to make my monthly payment. Those are his two options. So let's assume for a moment he doesn't want to take that FX risk. It's just not worth his time. He's not a currency speculator, for heaven's sakes. He's not Stan Druckenmiller. So he's going to go ahead and pay off that loan, and the benefit is he doesn't have to pay that interest that would have accrued. So now, all of a sudden, the dollars on his balance sheet, they go away, but so does the dollar liability. Okay, cool. Now let's go over to guy number 1. Let's assume he owns a hotel, and his customer is guy number 2, his best customer. And guy number 2 says, you know what, I'm just getting paid in rubles right now, so I don't have any dollars to pay you. Why don't you go ahead and take these red pieces of paper, these red R's that are in my bank account. So guy number 1 thinks about it. He's like, well, I don't know. It's a little weird, but okay, yeah, fine. So now he is left with a similar problem, but an even bigger problem, because he doesn't have any dollars on his balance sheet to begin with. So he, likewise, only has 2 options. He can go ahead and roll over this debt. So he goes to the bank and he says, you know what, I would really love it if I can go ahead and borrow the equivalent of $10,000 in rubles and then just pay off this dollar loan. So instead of owing you USD, I just owe you the red R, because I want to match up my cash flows with my liabilities. And the bank says, yeah, okay, we can go ahead and make that happen. But he has another option. He can take the FX risk, and he can take those rubles every single month and then sell them into the FX market to buy the dollars that he needs to make his monthly payment. Okay, well, let's take the last option first. Because remember, guy number 3 sold those rubles, and that's what brought the value of the dollar down, all else being equal. But now, guy number 1 has to buy those exact same dollars that guy number 3 sold. And he has to pay for them with the rubles. So now what we have is the opposite reaction. That if this brought the DXY down to 95, this counter action, if you want to call it that, would take the DXY straight back up to 100. But we're not done yet, because we have to look at the option of him rolling the debt over and taking the USD denominated loan and turning it into a ruble-based loan. Let's say he does that instead, which he'd probably do. So then that dollar loan goes away and is replaced by the ruble loan. Okay, fair enough. But notice, we don't have any dollar debt left. So if there's no dollar debt, then what happens to all the dollars? They're gone. So the drop in demand has dropped the supply. So my point is, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for the dollar to crash if the majority of dollars outside of the United States have been lent into existence. And this explains exactly what we talked about in step number 1, how Peter Schiff can be so right about the deficits, the debt, the Fed's balance sheet, the foreign central banks holding dollars or not holding dollars, the trade deficits. But instead of the dollar going down since 2008, it's gone straight up. Whoa, time out. I know a lot of you that are really paying attention are watching this video right now and saying, wait a minute, George, why on earth would this guy get rid of his debt if he thought the ruble was going to appreciate in value? That just decreases the burden of the debt moving forward. And why on earth would this guy roll over his debt? Why wouldn't he just keep the dollar-denominated debt and roll that over to more and more and more dollar loans, assuming that it is due in the near future? Because he knows that this ruble cash flow is going to appreciate in value, therefore the burden of the debt is going to decrease. This is a very fair question. But although it might look good on paper, and there could be some currency speculators that would be in this game, for the average Joe and Jane, the average business, the multinational corporation, it doesn't make sense. It's too much risk. Let me give you an example. I did a Twitter poll today and I asked a simple question. If you had a $500,000 mortgage, $3,000 a month payment, and all of a sudden your employer started paying you in rubles, what would you do? Would you pay off the loan? Would you roll the loan into a ruble denominated, let's say, mortgage? Or would you go ahead and roll the dice every month that the ruble didn't depreciate in value relative to the dollar, and therefore that monthly payment would take a bigger percentage of your overall paycheck? And almost 80% of the people who responded said they would choose option number 1 or option number 2. I'd like to remind you that both option 1 and 2 would lead to the supply of dollars decreasing by the original loan amount. And oh, by the way, if the supply of dollars is decreasing, that means less dollar cash flow that's available to service all the other outstanding dollar-denominated debt, which could result in a debt deleveraging that would make the dollar go much higher than just 100 on the DXY. Then the other rebuttal I know I'm going to get is, George, well, what if these guys just don't pay off their dollar debt? Then the supply of dollars stays the same and the amount of dollars just continues to circulate. Okay, fine. Let's assume that happens. But those dollars that are on their balance sheet are just simply liabilities of a bank. So if they don't pay back their debt, what happens to the bank? It blows up. If the banks blow up, their balance sheet's gone. Well, if their balance sheet is gone, so are all of their liabilities. And those liabilities were the dollar assets that the average Joes, or guy 1, 2, and 3, had on their balance sheet. So my point is, if the banks blow up, then all the dollars blow up as well. Step number 3. Remember at the beginning of this video, I said just because the dollar hasn't collapsed in the past doesn't mean that it won't collapse in the future. We just have to understand the mechanics involved so we can determine the probabilities of it collapsing, and then also, probably more importantly, understand how it could collapse. The punchline here is the system would have to change. Let me show you what I'm referring to. We'll keep it super simple. Let's say this circle represents the amount of dollars, especially outside the United States, as we went over in step number 2. The majority of those dollars are credit. They were lent into existence. Let's compare this to Argentina. Everyone knows that they've been experiencing hyperinflation. Their currency literally has collapsed. Where if you took a pie chart of 100% of the pesos, the majority of those pesos would not be credit. They would actually be currency. And let's remember, the credit is simply a claim on the currency. In this case, a claim on the dollar. It isn't an actual dollar. The actual dollars are just the Fed's balance sheet. We call it base money, or M0. And this is essentially just bank reserves plus currency in circulation, green pieces of paper. So let's go down to this next visual, because this is where I think it really will hit home. Let's assume for a moment the Fed's balance sheet is this red circle. All $7 trillion of bank reserves and currency in circulation. All right, well, this black circle represents the amount of credit, especially outside the United States. The claims on dollars. In other words, this black circle represents the credit currency that can fluctuate up or down based on demand. This red circle is the amount of, let's say, currency, dollars, that exist that cannot fluctuate up or down based on demand. So let's assume this red circle increases in size to that big. Wow, huge. The Fed just increased the size of their balance sheet from 7 trillion, let's say up to $10 trillion. But look at it in relationship to the amount of dollar credit. It's basically insignificant. And this is why the Fed can take their balance sheet from 800 billion up to 7 trillion, and the dollar just goes straight up. It doesn't even blink. You compare this to, let's say, the Argentinian central bank. Not sure what their name is. It was called ACB. This red circle represents their balance sheet, which is the base money. These are the pesos. And the amount of credit is represented by this black circle. So if they increase the size of their balance sheet, they are increasing the amount of currency. They're not increasing the amount of credit. So if the amount of currency goes up to this size, but we still have this amount of credit, and in reality the amount of credit would probably shrink even further, then what's going to happen to the value of that Argentinian peso? It's likely going to go down even further. Or like Peter Schiff would say, it will crash. So the next question becomes, what would lead to this ratio changing dramatically to where it would impact the dollar negatively? It would be right here, a central bank digital currency. But we'll have to save that for a topic of another video. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.